Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Srinath, for this invitation from Vivekananda Yoga University. It's an honor and a privilege to be associated with this new institution, and I look forward to great things in the field of yoga. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. The topic of my presentation is the biomedical science and research on yoga, and I'm going to be focusing in this presentation on what we know about the science of how yoga works, the psychophysiology of yoga. But let me start with some introductory comments in terms of the breadth and depth of yoga and yoga therapy in Western society, because this is an area of research as well. And we have a good deal of knowledge about the breadth and depth of yoga practices. In the United States, we have a survey that's run by the federal government called the National Health Interview Survey. And this survey surveys complementary and integrated medicine practices, and included in that are metrics on the practice of yoga. So these are statistics from a number of surveys that have been done every 5 years. And what you can see is that in 2017, 14.3% of US adults had practiced yoga in the past year. Now, from an epidemiological or sociological perspective, this kind of a percentage in society is really indicative of a major movement. This is a huge percentage of the US population from that perspective. What is also remarkable is the trend that you see here, from 5% in 2002 tripling to 2017. So this is really a remarkable trend and increase. And if we expect the next survey to be in 2022 and another 50% increase, that would be 20% of the US population. So this is something that's really remarkable. Now, if you see this kind of statistic, you would expect to see the evidence in the culture, and I think that evidence is there as well. It's in the media, so these are well-known American magazines, the cover of Life. This caption reads, "Dogs do it, kids do it, even desperate housewives do it. Why we've become a yoga nation." Famous actress, part of that television series, Desperate Housewives, and a cover of Time magazine some time ago, The Science of Yoga, with famous model Christy Turlington on the cover. One of the unfortunate things, however, is that the media is portraying an image of yoga that tends to be associated with the belief of who it is and what yoga is. And unfortunately, these images suggest that yoga is practiced only by thin, rich, elegant white females in leotards. And of course, we know that yoga practice is much more than that, and that yoga practice is adaptable to all populations, including men, the elderly, children, and people with disorders and disabilities, and can be adapted to virtually any population. So this is an image problem that yoga has actually in the West, that we as a yoga community have a responsibility to educate the public. And part of that education is really coming up with the science. The popularity has expanded to the extent that we now have 5 airports in the United States which have dedicated yoga rooms. So as you're making your flight connection, you can go into these airport rooms and practice your yoga. And these are major airports: San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, Fort Worth, and Miami. Another metric of the sort of popularity of anything in a culture is measured by the toys that children have. So now you can see that there is a made-to-move Barbie doll, which can be articulated into many different yoga postures. In addition, there's actually a Breathe With Me Barbie, which comes with 5 guided meditations. And for those girls who want to move on in yoga, they can become a yoga teacher Barbie. And this Barbie comes complete with a yoga mat, water bottle. So this is really indicative of how popular yoga has become. Now, it's not just the girls. For the boys, instead of toy soldiers, there are now toys called Yoga Joes. So these little toy plastic soldiers, instead of carrying weapons, are doing asanas. So this is really remarkable. And another remarkable characteristic is what's been going on in New York Times Square for over a decade now. Every June 21st, 18,000 people have been registering to practice yoga all day long on New York Times Square. So this is an international icon that is taken over by yoga practice. So these are really remarkable photographs. And of course, as many of you know, Prime Minister Modi is an avid yoga practitioner, and he is the one who was responsible for pushing through the United Nations proclamation of International Day of Yoga on June 21st. So here he is in June 21st of 2015, the first formal celebration in New Delhi, and he's practicing, as you can see, with a few friends. But of course, people like to do things big in India, so he brought a lot of friends with him. 50,000 people, I think, were there for this inaugural event. And the Indian consulates around the world have promoted and really pushed this whole celebration of International Day of Yoga internationally. So this is 2015. This is taken in China. So you can see that this is now really becoming a worldwide phenomenon. Another aspect is that the advertising industry is well aware of this. That's their job. They want to know, they need to know what the public is into. And yoga has this healthful image, so the advertising industry is actually using yoga images in many cases to promote things that have somewhat of a negative connotation. So here they're selling alcohol. This is a vodka bottle doing a headstand on a yoga mat. Here they're selling a sleeping pill. This morning was brought to you by a good night's sleep with an image of a yoga asana. And of course, if you watch television at all, there are many pharmaceutical ads, and a lot of those have people practicing yoga, suggesting that if you take their particular pharmaceutical, you will be healthy like someone practicing yoga. Large corporations have really used this as well. This is a number of years ago. McDonald's was offering DVDs of fitness, and they had a yoga DVD. And then out of a Connecticut rest stop, I brought a fruit and yogurt. And on my fruit and yogurt cup, there was someone practicing yoga, complete with this meditative Gyan Mudra posture. So it's really remarkable to see how deeply yoga has penetrated itself into American culture. Another aspect of yoga that is now becoming very popular is the whole idea of yogic therapy, which first became popular at the beginning of the 20th century in India. That popularity grew in India until the government in India commissioned this book, Yogic Therapy, in 1963. That popularity continued and has come to the West as well. Now there are dozens of books, including this one by my colleague Timothy McCall, Yoga as Medicine, and there's now books on yoga for specific disorders. So this has really grown as well. And you can see that in the media as well. Another cover of Time magazine, How Your Mind Can Heal Your Body, with an unmistakable yoga practice image. And in fact, this is now becoming formalized into a profession. So I work closely with the International Association of Yoga Therapists, which accredits yoga therapy schools, which then certify individual yoga therapists. This organization has an annual members meeting. They have a research journal called the International Journal of Yoga Therapy, of which I'm the editor-in-chief. And they also are cognizant of the value of research and support the annual Symposium on Research that I coordinate. So let's turn our attention now to the psychophysiology of yoga. How does yoga work on the mind and body? What are the mechanisms involved? And this is a growing area of research. In fact, on the left is a book that's put out by Harvard Health Publications called An Introduction to Yoga. And I was the medical editor for this book, and we cover a lot of the research that's been done on yoga. But what's really remarkable about this is that on the Harvard Health Publishing website, there are actually articles on the benefits of yoga. This one talking about the research on yoga for anxiety and depression. And what's really remarkable about this is that we have here a major leading medical school, Harvard Medical School, who's got their name and logo right next to yoga. It's almost as though Harvard Medical School is invested in promoting yoga, which is another sign of the times. Because if you had asked me 25 years ago if this was conceivable, I would have said no way. But clearly yoga has become extremely embedded and extremely popular. And the research is growing, as I said, dramatically. And a sign of that is the appearance of reviews and meta-analyses of conducted studies that have been done. And that really is a sign that there's a body of research out there that's evaluating and summarizing. And so scientists will publish review papers and meta-analyses of yoga research studies, and I'm showing just a few of these here. So on the top is the paper that addresses how yoga reduces stress in terms of body cognition and emotion. This one is reviewing yoga and immune system functioning. This one, neurophysiological and neurocognitive mechanisms, stress again, and at the bottom, self-regulatory mechanisms of yoga for psychological health. And we have also reviewed this in our medical textbook, The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare. This is a unique book that summarizes a lot of the research that's been done on so-called yoga therapy. It is an edited medical textbook written in modern medical language by 60 yoga researchers internationally. And on chapter 4, again, we summarize the psychophysiology of yoga from the perspective of the research that has been done. Now, I want to take you back historically to some of the early research that was done on yoga. And one of the types of research that was done was to examine the yoga masters, these very accomplished yoga practitioners in India, and to try and understand what was going on with their mind and their brain when they were doing these yoga practices. And this is one of the strongest studies in that era. This was done in the 1950s. A team of researchers traveled all over India for an entire year. And they were hunting down these yoga masters and these proficient practitioners and hooking them up to the recording equipment you see in this picture. And what they concluded from this extensive study was that physiologically, yogic meditation represents deep relaxation of the autonomic nervous system. Now, this is significant from several perspectives. First of all, the idea of regulating the autonomic nervous system is underlying a central construct in the field, not only of yoga, but of the entire field of what we call mind-body medicine. And that construct is the idea of self-regulation of internal state, both psychological state and physical state. The idea that through these training practices of yoga, you can develop the ability to control internal functioning, both mental and physical. Now, the autonomic nervous system is particularly interesting because it was originally called autonomic because it was believed to be automatic. In other words, you had no input or could not put any input into that system. And here are these yoga practitioners able to modulate and manipulate the autonomic nervous system. The other thing that's important about the autonomic nervous system is that this is the system that is involved in mediating the stress and emotion response in the brain and body. So this suggests that yogis have this ability to modulate their stress and emotion response, something that I'm going to show you evidence for. Now, of course, yoga is most known for the physical postures, the asanas. These exercises are very different than Western aerobic type exercises. And they're much more focused on flexibility, on isometric holding of exercises, specific movements, body-mind coordination, balance. And there are many studies that have been done that are very objective measures. These are measured in degrees and angles of motion and the degree to which individuals can stretch and so on. So this is very strong evidence. This is one example of the many studies that have been done on yoga asana practice showing that you can take naive individuals who have never practiced yoga, and after a couple of months you can see statistically significant improvements in a number of measures of flexibility, in muscular endurance, and also in muscle strength. And of course, there's a mind-body connection, and that mind-body connection works both ways. So when you manipulate the body, you have an impact on mental state. And of course, the asanas are unique. They generate more of a relaxation effect, I believe, than aerobic type exercises in the West. Now, of course, these practices, I think, are very healthful. And that is, I think, due to the nature of these types of practices and exercises. So this is a study that compared traditional exercisers, individuals who are long-distance runners and actually sprinters as well. And what they were measuring in this study was fat mass percent, which is a key metric in cardiovascular disease risk. And what you can see is that the control subjects who were not, intense regular exercisers had much higher levels of fat mass percent than they did the long distance runners and sprinters. But look at the yoga group. It is as good as, if not slightly better than, these two categories. So there's something about yoga, despite being heavily aerobic like long distance running and sprinting, has a very healthful effect on something like fat mass percent. Now, another important practice within yoga, of course, is the sense of relaxation. And in yoga classes, we have Shavasana, or corpse pose, in which we become aware of our physical body and allow this body to deeply relax. In fact, this has made its way into Western psychology for the number of decades, and it's been called progressive relaxation. So this is one study that was done on progressive relaxation technique, which is very similar to Shavasana. And what you can see in this randomized controlled trial, the dark bars are the progressive relaxation group. You can see the reduction in perceived stress. The control condition had no change. In terms of anxiety, also a reduction, but no change in the control condition. You can see an increase in the sense of relaxation. And then there's also objective measures, a reduction in heart rate with progressive relaxation, no change in the control condition. They also, in this study, measured the stress hormone cortisol. And what you can see is before and after, a reduction in the progressive relaxation group of the stress hormone cortisol, no change in the control condition. So clearly, the relaxation, an important practice within yoga, individually and separately, has its impact on the stress response and on the sense of perceived stress. Another key practice within traditional yoga is the breathing techniques and exercises, or pranayama. And one of the most common and most well-studied breathing techniques is the long, slow, deep yogic breathing pattern. And there's an enormous amount of research now that's been done recently on slow breathing and its effects both on the physical body as well as on mental and emotional functioning. One thing about long, slow breathing is that it's a highly efficient form of gas exchange, which means that if your body is challenged, such as at high altitude where there are low levels of oxygen, yoga practitioners are able to maintain higher levels of oxygen saturation at high altitude than control subjects that don't do pranayama practice. Furthermore, that level of oxygen saturation is equivalent to Sherpas who were raised at high altitude. So there's something about this pranayama practice, this slow breathing, that is highly efficient. And it's very effective at improving gas exchange. Another aspect of slow breathing is that it has direct impact on the autonomic nervous system. And of course, the autonomic nervous system is involved in the regulation of blood pressure. It's involved in the regulation of stress. It's involved in the regulation of emotion. In this particular study, they gave the participants a stressful intervention. One group practiced slow breathing, the other one did not. And what you can see in the control group that did not practice slow breathing, this is the increase in their stress level. Those that were practicing slow breathing had a much lower increase in stress. So breathing techniques have a direct impact on the stress response. Finally, as I mentioned, this control of the autonomic nervous system means that it's involved in blood pressure regulation as well. In this study, what you can see, and this is the measure of systolic blood pressure, during the period of immediate slow breathing, you can see an immediate reduction in systolic blood pressure, and when the breathing stopped, it then resumed to normal. This was the control group that had no change over time. So this is really remarkable, and we're starting to really understand the neuroscience of how breathing has an impact on both the central and the autonomic nervous system. I want to jump to sort of the pinnacle of modern neuroscientific technology. And this is the technology we call neuroimaging. This is a very powerful form of research that uses these large machines, these brain scanners. This is particularly fMRI, one of the types of scanners that's out there. The power of this technology is that we can peer into the live active brain during the act of meditation, and we can pinpoint with extreme accuracy, within millimeters, which region of the brain is being activated during meditation. Furthermore, there's a number of other things that you can measure with that. You can also measure changes from second to second. So it's an extremely powerful technique because it gives us high precision. And because we know which each region of the brain is responsible for in terms of human behavior, we can then make conclusions about where meditation is acting and how it's influencing our brain functioning and then ultimately also our bodily functioning. Now, one of the kinds of studies that's been done with brain scanning is to ask the question, do the brains of long-term meditators behave differently than non-meditators? Are there regions of the brain that are more active in meditators than non-meditators? What's the difference between these? There's a number of studies that have done this kind of thing with long-term meditators. And in this particular study that I've chosen to show you, they showed that a number of regions of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, the parietal cortex, thalamus, putamen, caudate, and midbrain, all had changes. And the observed changes appear in structures of the brain that underlie the attention network and also those that relate to emotion and autonomic function. So the interesting finding here is that this very powerful objective technique is verifying what we see behaviorally, this ability to regulate emotion, autonomic function, and stress. So that's consistent. Now, there's a change in the attention networks. Well, meditation, most simply defined, is the focus of attention. So when you begin to meditate, when you focus your attention on a mantra or on a breath, or on a candle or any kind of other target of meditation, you are engaging the attention networks in the brain to bring focus to that target. When you do that consistently over time, regularly with practice, you become better at focusing your attention. And so it is no surprise, really, that we see changes in the attention networks in the brain that behave more efficiently in meditators than in non-meditators. Now, another thing that brain scanning can look at is individual molecules. These are very limited as to what can be looked at, but one of the molecules that can be looked at is the well-known inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA. This is a transmitter that's located throughout the central nervous system. And levels of GABA in the brain have been associated with mood state. So in this particular study that was conducted at Boston University, what they did was they scanned the brains of individuals before and after a single yoga class. So before and after a single yoga class. And they looked at the levels of GABA. And what they found was that after the yoga class, the level of GABA had increased. So again, a very powerful objective measure. And the increase in the level of GABA was correlated very tightly, of course, with mood state. Mood state was improved after the yoga class. So this tells us not only do yoga practices change brain activity, they also change brain biochemistry. The other thing I wanted to share with you is another finding, and the brain is known for having a capacity called neuroplasticity. This is the ability of the brain to change its connections and its actual structure. So people that engage in a certain type of behavior, that region of the brain increases its size in order to accommodate that behavior because more connections are made between neurons. Those neurons require more blood flow, so there's more innervation of blood vessels. They require support cells, glial cells. So that region of the brain actually changes its structure with behavior. So for example, if you start to learn how to juggle, those regions of the brain that are involved in motor coordination and visual coordination of the juggling act, those regions of the brain start to increase in structure. So of course, yoga is a behavioral practice, incorporating postures, breathing, deep relaxation, and meditation. So what can we see in terms of long-term changes in brain structure? And this slide shows figures from a study that was done at our National Institutes of Health. And what they looked at was the tolerance to pain, specifically cold pain in this particular study. And they looked at long-term yoga practitioners and compared them with non-yoga practitioners. The long-term yoga practitioners are in the black dots, and what you can see is that they are clustered at relatively the high end of tolerance to pain, whereas the non-yoga practitioners are clustered at the low end of pain tolerance. In other words, there's something about yoga practice that improves your ability to tolerate pain. The other thing they did at the same time was they did brain scans to measure the volume of the region of the brain that is involved in pain regulation, in this case the insula. And they measured the gray matter volume. And what you can see is that on average, the long-term yoga practitioners had a larger volume of this region of the brain, whereas the non-yoga practitioners had a lower volume in that region of the brain. And on the graph on the right-hand side, this is actually practice dependent. So this is the amount of years that the individual long-term practitioners had practiced yoga. And what you can see is that compared to gray matter volume, there's a tight relationship, such that the longer that they had practiced yoga, the larger that region of the brain was. So this is now telling us that not only can we change brain activity and brain biochemistry, we can also change brain structure. So what's the significance of this? Well, the significance of this is that these are very powerful objective techniques. This now puts us into the realm of modern science and takes away the argument against yoga that it's just a placebo effect, it's just a hobby, it's just a lightweight kind of thing. You know, people imagine that they're getting better, so they're getting better. And our answer to this with this data is no. This is real biology. In fact, these changes in brain activity, structure, and biochemistry are clinically significant, as strong as any drug that you can take. So this is really putting us into the field of real solid evidence behind the effects of yoga on the brain and on the body. Now this cartoon reads, meditation isn't what you think. So there's kind of a double meaning to this cartoon. And of course, the simplest definition of meditation is this focus of attention in a relaxed, non-analytical manner. You focus on the word, or you focus on a mantra, or you focus on your breath. And what happens in the meditation act, of course, is that you hold your focus for a certain period of time, and then suddenly you notice that your mind has wandered off. You start thinking about something else, and then a chain of thought comes on, and then finally a thought occurs to you, you're supposed to be meditating. And so then you release the mind wandering, and you come back and you focus your attention. And of course, everyone that meditates experiences this cycle of mental focus and mind wandering, mental focus, mind wandering. Now, that is still beneficial, but in the real world, meditation is not just the focus phase, because we are also mind wandering during meditation. So if you're really going to understand the act of meditation in the real world, we should understand not just the focus phase, we should also understand the mind-wandering phase. And this has actually become an area of intensive research. In fact, and this is actually reflected by the Upanishads, where really we have the first sort of definition of meditation. So this is mind-wandering here defined. This mind of mind is extremely restless. The mind wanders among objects as a monkey does from tree to tree. Now, of course, nothing has changed in the 2,000 more years that the Upanishads were written. But now, instead of thinking about a monkey, we're probably thinking about an SUV or something more modern. This, I believe, is the first ever definition of meditation. The man who has a discriminating intellect as his driver and a controlled mind as the reins reaches the end of that path at supreme state of Vishnu. This is done as an analogy, suggesting there's a benefit to the focus of attention. And the analogy is to a charioteer driving horses. The horses are the thoughts. If you stand in the chariot and let the horses go where they want, you don't get to go anywhere. But if you hold the reins, if you focus the attention, you get to go somewhere and you get benefit from that chariot. So this is the idea here, that the focus of attention has positive benefits.
Hello?
Now, the study of mind wandering is, as I say, an active area of research. Now, this was a paper that was published by a Harvard research team in our most prestigious journal, Science. They studied mind wandering in the general population and found that people's minds wandered frequently regardless of what they were doing. But people were less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were not. This is the new finding. This first finding, of course, this was stated in the Upanishads. So clearly there's an emotional cost to allowing our minds to wander excessively. And I think the reason for this is in the content of mind wandering, which is dominated by survival issues. Survival issues are inherently stressful because you don't know the outcome of survival issues. Will I be able to make it to work on time? Will I have enough money to pay the mortgage this month? Will I be able to send my son to university, et cetera, et cetera? So when we allow our minds to wander excessively, we can develop this negative mood state from the chronic stress reaction of our own thought processes. So what happens in meditation is that we focus attention. When we engage the attention networks, mind wandering ceases. So it's kind of like a mind-wandering holiday, if you will. We are free from the mind wandering. There's a sense of peace when we focus our attention. But what is more important is that during the practice of meditation regularly, we are learning a skill of the self-regulation of attention and of thought processes. And this ultimately leads to the realization that we are not our thoughts, that we have what we call metacognition. And this is a very powerful self-regulation state. In fact, we can see this in the brain scanner. These are people meditating in the scanner. During the focus phase of meditation, what's being activated is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This is in the frontal regions of the attention networks of the brain. When the mind is wandering, it's a much diffuser collection of regions called the default mode network. And we are starting to understand the neurophysiology of the relationship between these different brain states. For example, we now know that the prefrontal cortex has inhibitory connections with the limbic system, which is responsible for the stress and emotion response. Another area of modern science is molecular biology. This is looking at how genes change their activity in response to behavior. So for example, if you smoke a lot of cigarettes, you are turning on cancer genes that may produce a tumor. However, if you engage in healthy behaviors, you will upregulate the activity of genes that are good for you. So clearly meditation and yoga have positive benefits. We should be able to see changes in gene expression, and that certainly has been observed. So this is a review paper looking at the molecular signature of mind-body interventions, showing that many genes change their activity with practices like mindfulness yoga and the relaxation response. And just to show you one specific study, this was a yogic meditation called Kirtan Kriya, and in this study they showed suppression of the expression of inflammation-related genes and the upregulated expression of genes involved in immune function. So again, we can see this is happening at the cellular molecular level. These practices penetrate the body down to that level in which our genes are actually changing their behavior to accommodate the benefits of these yoga practices. Now, of course, I've talked a lot about stress management, and this is one area that's very strong. It's one of the major reasons that people come to yoga practice. In this survey study, almost 80% of beginners said stress management was one reason they came to yoga. And a lot of research has shown this. So there's a number of reviews. This most recent review revealed that most types of yoga have positive effects on stress reduction in healthy populations. And it's not just in perceived stress, it's in objective measures like the stress hormone cortisol, blood pressure, heart rate, and even blood lipids. Changes in the both branches of the stress response system. And just to show you some individual examples from our research, this was a yoga study done on mostly education professionals and teachers. The black bar is the yoga group showing reductions in perceived stress at the end of a 6-week yoga program maintained at a 2-month follow-up. The control condition, no change. And then resilience to stress increasing at the long-term follow-up, no change in the control condition. We also did a similar program in Harvard Medical School doctors. After 6 weeks of yoga at the hospital, they had reductions in perceived stress that were maintained and improvements in resilience that were maintained. Another thing that changes as you practice yoga is an increase in mind-body awareness through the meditative aspect of yoga. And ultimately, this leads to improvements in mind-body awareness, or what is now known as mindfulness. This is a survey study done in Germany on long-term yoga practitioners showing that those practitioners that practiced at a high level had higher scores of mindfulness than those that practiced at moderate or marginal levels, suggesting there's a tight relationship between yoga practice and the experience of mind-body awareness or mindfulness. We've seen this in short-term studies. So these are the same education professionals showing increases in scores on mindfulness in the yoga group, no change in the control condition, and also in the Harvard physicians, improvements in the mindfulness score maintained, if not even enhanced, at the long-term follow-up. Another thing that yoga ultimately leads to over time is these contemplative states of consciousness. Over the short term, we're seeing this arousal reduction and improvement in physical well-being. This happens within minutes and certainly over a single yoga class. As we practice over weeks and months, we develop the skills of mind-body awareness, resilience to stress, and the ability to self-regulate our internal state. But what many people report after months and years of practice, and even after a yoga lifestyle, is a psychological or philosophical transformation. People will say things like, yoga changed my life. This is something deeper and more profound. And this is that same German survey showing that spiritual well-being is dependent upon how intense the long-term yoga practitioners are practicing. There's a dose-response effect. The high-level practitioners have the highest scores on spiritual well-being, as are the scores on positive psychological states of hope, connectedness, and experiences of sense and meaning. And we can even see this over the short term. There's an experience of flow during the practice of certain activities. We've studied this in young adult musicians and showed that after 6 weeks of yoga, we can improve the experience of the flow state. So this now brings me to sort of the most important slide, if you will, of my entire presentation. This is a logic model, which really summarizes all of these mechanisms. So yoga, as we're defining it, is not just the postures. It is traditional yoga, which in most studios and practices incorporates the postures, the breathing techniques, the relaxation, and the meditation component. Now, all 4 of these practices together in yoga or independently will improve physical functioning in a box that I've called fitness. These are things like flexibility, strength, coordination, balance, respiratory function, self-efficacy. Through all 4 of these practices, again, together or independently, improve self-regulation of internal state, especially stress and emotion regulation, which leads to the skills of resilience to stress and equanimity in the faces of the ups and downs of emotions, which leads to an overall psychological self-efficacy. It is largely the meditative component that's responsible for the engagement of the attention networks to increase mind-body awareness or mindfulness, which improves cognition, concentration, and ultimately leads to this very powerful state we call metacognition. And metacognition really is the topic that Patanjali's Yoga Sutras really are talking about, is this idea of self-regulation of thought processes. And then finally, a phenomenon that happens typically over longer practice, largely through the meditative experiences, this induction of the unitive state during meditation, experiences of transcendence, flow, which leads many people to this deeper transformation and a change in life meaning and purpose. And one thing you can see from this is that we're making changes from the gross level of connective tissue and muscle all the way to the deepest experiences that humans have. And the evidence is really strong for this box here because this is very objective measures. We know this is very concrete and very real. And over the past 2 decades, we've seen enormous research with this modern technology to really tell us about how self-regulation and mind-body awareness are participating in human functioning. And the least amount of research at this point in time, at least, is done on spirituality. But because of this broad spectrum of changes over a wide range of human functioning, we see changes in global human functionality, all the way from the gross level of physical, mental health, and performance to the deeper levels of stress and emotion regulation, awareness and mindfulness, and ultimately metacognition. And finally, for long-term practice, positive behavior changes, well-being, values, life purpose and meaning, and what we can call pure spirituality. So the beauty of this model is that it's based upon modern biomedical science. Not only that, it gives us a language that we can now describe how yoga works. So when you're caught in the elevator for this proverbial 5-minute elevator talk that someone asks you, I know you practice yoga, how does it work? Now instead of using yoga language about prana and chakras and kundalini, now you can start talking about respiratory function, flexibility, stress and emotion regulation, resilience, mind-body awareness, and even transcendence. This puts us into the language of modern medicine, which happens to be the language of modern society. So this is the kind of language that we need, and this is the kind of job that I'm doing in much of my work in promoting the knowledge that we have of research to yoga practitioners and teachers so that they can spread this more effectively throughout our modern society. So a lot of the research that I've shown you was supported in part by the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health. I also work closely with the International Association of Yoga Therapists. I'm also the Director of Research for the Kundalini Research Institute, which supports the style of yoga that I practice. And I'm also the Director of Yoga Research for Yoga Alliance. And my role there is exactly what I do in this presentation that I've given you, which is teach about the science behind yoga. We have a number of research videos, a number of research webinars, and a large collection of yoga research citations that have been selected, put on this website, which is free access to everyone. So I'm happy to show this last slide to you. This is where we are at. Actually, in modern society, we're experiencing this epidemic of non-communicable disease, both mental and physical health problems. We do not have the mind-body strategies necessary to prevent this. But yoga, through that logic model, has all of the solutions to the risk factors that are generating these diseases. So if we can do the science, we can change our policy in terms of the implementation of yoga into mainstream society, into our schools, into the healthcare system, and into the workplace, and hopefully change this over time to a better looking outcome in this cartoon here. And the last thing I wanted to do is to share with you the course that I'm going to be giving at the Vivekananda Yoga University. And this is a course that basically will take this one lecture and spread it over an entire course. And I want to share with you the outline for the course in terms of the lectures that will be offered. So we will start with an introduction to biomedical yoga research in general, an understanding of how biomedical research works, what the characteristics are, and the unique characteristics of yoga research itself. We'll talk about demographic research on yoga, the survey studies that have been done, the barriers to research, the reasons for adoption of yoga practices, the demographics of who it is that's practicing yoga, the percentages of the population. And then we'll do what I just did in this talk, which would be to talk about the basic research about what's the research on the exercises, the asanas and the relaxation practices. What's the research on pranayama and what's the research on meditation? What's the research on yoga as a whole when it's offered together, independent of these four components of yoga? And then we'll go into yoga therapy research, which is a large and growing body of research. We'll look at physical and health performance, disease prevention. We'll talk about special populations like prisons and schools and workplaces. We'll talk about mental health and spirituality, and then a number of very clinical conditions, mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, cardiorespiratory and metabolic diseases, cancer and musculoskeletal diseases. And then we will engage the students as well in projects that have them working on a personal practice and then have them apply research metrics to their practice, and these will be presented to the whole class as student presentations as part of the course evaluation. So it's not just the academic component, there will be a very real practice component that's involved in this course and a research component that's involved in this course to really bring home how yoga research is done and what the benefits are. So I'm going to stop there and thank you for your attention.
The first question is from Mr. Tom. What changes have you seen in yoga research in the last 20 years?
Well, I mean, just the changes I showed you. I mean, the neuroimaging, the molecular biological changes, these were absent, I mean, before 20 years ago. We just had nothing like this before. And these are such powerful and objective techniques that they give us incredible precision. Especially in the brain, the whole idea of the attention networks, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. We're coming up with enormous knowledge about how the neuroscience of meditation works. And then there's highlights that are just starting to appear. We're starting, as I said, the amount of research on pranayama is really remarkable. Just to give you one amazing example, there was a study that was done on rats. They conditioned these rats to slow breathe. So they had a population of rats that were breathing slowly and a population of rats that were breathing in their normal rate. Then they gave a stress test to both populations. the rats that were breathing slowly had a less stress response. So this is telling us that this whole idea of pranayama is not just in humans, it's actually in all mammals. It is that wired into our nervous systems. So these are remarkable findings that are telling us that these changes really can be investigated, and we can really understand, how we are experiencing these changes. So it really is a fascinating time in the field of yoga research, and the past 20 years has just been exponential in terms of the number of studies done and the kinds of remarkable findings that we're seeing. And it's both basic research and understanding how it works, but also the clinical research. For example, in the fields of yoga for cancer and yoga for low back pain, the societies that are involved in research on cancer and low back pain are now recommending yoga as a viable treatment based upon all of the clinical trials that have been done on yoga for cancer and yoga for low back pain. And my laboratory just recently published a trial of yoga for generalized anxiety disorder that was in a leading medical journal, JAMA Psychiatry. So it's really remarkable time in which we are seeing this really rapid growth of yoga research and our understanding of how yoga is working.
This is from Jennifer. How is yoga research and yoga therapy related to yoga practice?
Well, all of the research has yoga practice involved. And so there's many different styles of yoga. Different researchers have their preference of what they use. And of course, we're looking at different populations as well. A study on yoga for the elderly would most likely use chair yoga. And a study for low back pain would likely use practices that are going to be safe for low back patients, but probably also working on elements of the musculoskeletal system to help improve back pain. But the application of yoga is critical in the study because you need to do something in order to get a result. And then, of course, you can choose many different things to do within yoga. And so we have, oftentimes we will have yoga experts as part of the research team. And these yoga experts will then construct a yoga intervention that they believe, based upon their experience, is most beneficial for that particular condition or for that particular research goal. But it's very important to have very high quality yoga practice in order to get the benefit. So if you're bringing yoga into schools, there are certain constraints that you have to follow. If you're bringing yoga into the workplace, there's certain constraints that you have to follow. So it takes a lot of tinkering to really adjust the yoga intervention for the purposes of your research study.
Is it beneficial to consciously stop mind wandering?
Well, we stop mind wandering all the time. When you do any kind of task, you're immediately task-oriented and you're focused on that task. So if you're doing a math problem or you're playing a chess game, you're not mind wandering. In fact, you're impeding your game if you allow mind wandering to intrude in that kind of activity. So we consciously focus our attention all of the time. Now, mind wandering is not bad for you. Mind wandering is part of the way the brain works, and we don't want to stop mind wandering. We just want to avoid excessive mind wandering. We want to have some degree of self-regulation. We don't want to be in a situation where a person is saying, I can't control my thoughts, I'm constantly thinking about negative things. This leads ultimately to mental disorders like anxiety and depression, in which the thoughts are automatic and producing a lot of suffering. So this is where the whole idea of self-regulation of thought processes and the control of mind wandering, the ability to stop mind wandering, becomes valuable.
As we are running out of time, I can take one last question. Can you elaborate on metacognition? What is it and why is it important?
So metacognition is the central idea is that you are not your thoughts. You have thoughts, but you are capable of stepping back and watching those thoughts move by and change, and a chain of thought from one thought to the next to the next to the next. The fact that you can step back and watch those thoughts go by means that you are not those thoughts. You have the ability to sort of step back. That's different than automatic behavior, in which you think and then that automatically is an action. There's no watcher. There's no separation between the thought processes and the your deeper self, which is this idea of meta. Meta means above. So it's really above cognition. And metacognition happens to be the most central construct behind the most powerful and common form of psychotherapy today called cognitive behavioral therapy. In cognitive behavioral therapy, you learn to recognize your own thought processes. And it's typically applied in disorders. So for an anxiety disorder, for example, you're having anxious thoughts. Those thoughts are not just a symptom of the disease. They are actually the disease itself. And so if you're able to intervene and change those thought processes, you actually reduce the disease. So metacognition is very powerful and really involves this idea of self-regulation of thought processes. It's you, the higher you, that is able to self-regulate your own thought processes. So you take more ownership of your thought processes than you might have had before.